When Laman and Lemuel call Lehi a visionary man, they're not just name-calling. They were using the language of Deuteronomy 13 and 18 to charge him with being a false prophet. That's what they were doing. According to the standards in those chapters, a prophet who speaks words that do not come to pass or who leads people away from the established statutes was to be rejected. They were declaring their father by the very nature of his spiritual claims and his disregard for the safety that could be found in Jerusalem. They were saying he was a fraud. Hello, and welcome to FAIR's Come Follow Me podcast for Old Testament year. I am Jennifer Roach Lees. Today we are talking about 2 Chronicles. Actually, that's not entirely true. We're actually talking about Laman and Lemuel. But we need to understand why 2 Chronicles would be important to actually understand Laman and Lemuel. So hold on, we will get to them. Let me give you a brief intro to where we are because the timeline gets wonky. This week, we're actually talking about, in 2 Chronicles, chapters 14 to 20, 26 and 30. We've actually skipped all of 1 Chronicles, but there is a good deal of what happens in 1 and 2 Chronicles in 1 and 2 Kings. There's a lot of repeats. It's covered there and it's covered here, so we skip some of those. The stories are told from different perspectives, and there is value in reading them. But you can see why it's left out of the lectionary readings. There's already too much Old Testament to read. So we're getting kind of a little edited down version of what's important. So since 1 and 2 Kings covers the same time period roughly as 1 and 2 Chronicles, it might not be obvious that the kings we're talking about today actually come before King Josiah, who we talked about last week. Right? The timeline is wonky. We'll start with King Asa, and he lived about 300 years before Josiah. And then his son, Jehoshaphat, and then we skip about 70 years, and we'll finish the reading with King Uzziah and Hezekiah. The final king in this week's reading, Hezekiah, he lives about 50 years before Josiah. So if we were doing this in timeline order, this episode would have happened last week, and last week's would have happened this week. But that's where we are. So back to Laman and Lemuel. What do they have to do with this? For many readers of the Book of Mormon, Laman and Lemuel are kind of stock characters. They're just the perennial, bad brothers. We see them through the eyes of their younger brother, Nephi, who depicts them as this single grumbling unit. They're defined by their lack of faith and their tendency towards physical intimidation, their lack of belief, sometimes their lack of obedience. But is that really the whole story? Or has Nephi, in his role as narrator, with a very specific point of view, kind of flattened down his brothers? If that is what happened, it's for good reason. He can't get into all of Laman and Lemuel's backstory. It doesn't really matter at that point in the Book of Mormon. However, you might understand a little bit better about what's going on with them by understanding what's going on in today's Old Testament readings. Scholar Grant Hardy points out, understanding the Book of Mormon, Laman and Lemuel often come across as caricatures. They don't develop. They don't have distinct voices. Their primary mode of communication is simply complaining. Hardy argues that this is a flattening, that it's a deliberate narrative choice. And it's okay choice, but it is a choice. Nephi creates a context where his brothers kind of function as the opposition, not necessarily as real people. That's not the point of the story. However, if we take some modern scholarship to kind of look past the veneer, we find something really complex and really interesting that's kind of grounded in history. We find that Laman and Lemuel weren't necessarily just rebellious complainers in the sense that we normally imagine. Instead, they appear to be individuals deeply rooted in a specific, powerful religious movement of their time. We know when and where they lived. They were influenced by what was going on around them. Today, we are going to flesh out what Nephi flattened. We're going to stop looking at Laman and Lemuel as just wicked and start looking at them as people who bought into a particular expression of faithfulness. And they have a hard time understanding that the Lord is leading them in new ways. They might get called conservative or fundamentalist today. In their minds, the Lord works one way, and when their father tries to deviate from that, they don't like it. It's as if they were living in a closed canon. There was one righteous way to live, and when their father and brother propose a different way, they see that almost as an open canon that can't possibly be right. By understanding some of the socio-religious turmoil of their world, we can see the struggle within Lehi's family, that it wasn't just a spat. It was a little microcosm, actually, of what was going on in the nation of Israel. It was a clash between an older, visionary faith and a new, more legalistic orthodoxy. To understand why the older brothers were so indignant, we have to understand the world that they were fighting to stay in, the Jerusalem of King Josiah. We talked in depth about Josiah a couple weeks ago, and then a little bit again last week. But in case you forgot, King Josiah is king over the southern kingdom, Judah, where Jerusalem is. And there's a long line of wicked kings who come before him, and Josiah leads the way on purging some unhelpful practices out of the temple. And Josiah kind of lays down the law. Here's what worship is going to look like. Here is exactly where and when and why an altar will be built. And an altar will not be built anywhere else. It's like things had gotten way out of hand, and Josiah contracts everything back in. That's the world Laman and Lemuel would have grown up in. The world Lehi's family inherits in the late 7th century BC, they were in a religious upheaval. The era of shifting cultural pressures from the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Egyptians and others was a lot. For the average citizen in Jerusalem, the air was thick with burning incense, but it was also thick with a lot of smoke of political revolution. There was a lot going on. The defining event of this period was the sweeping reforms instituted by King Josiah. Josiah, if you remember, he was deeply moved by this book of the law that he finds while they're doing some temple renovations, widely believed by scholars to be an early version of Deuteronomy. He discovers it, he reads it, he believes it, and wants to act on it. The book warned that those who had violated Israel's covenant would be severely punished. How that happened in the first place is like a different story, but that's why Josiah decides to make these reforms. And he doesn't just clean up the city, though he does. He attempts to revolutionize the entire religious landscape. This meant removing the residue of the accommodations that have been made for foreign gods and foreign cultures. To understand what this means, we have to look at the older faith that was being targeted. So for centuries, Israelite worship had included elements that these reformers around Josiah found kind of scandalous. The presence of the Asherah pole, which is like this sacred tree or goddess symbol in the temple, that they found that scandalous. We talked last week about how meaning changes, that's where all of that comes from. The worship of what they called the hosts of heaven, which meant the sun, moon, and stars, the literal worship of the celestial bodies, the use of local shrines. They called them high places. They were essentially altars built out in the countryside or up on high places. That those altars were not just being used for worship of the Lord, they were being used for worship of foreign gods as well, and that the practices got really confused. So Josiah's reform attempted to centralize all ritual, sacrifice, and religious authority into one single location, the newly cleansed temple in Jerusalem. It had spread way out. He brings everything really tight back in. Religious practice at that time was so influenced by the practice of other cultures, it was hard to tell what was the worship of the true God and what was worship of idols. So Josiah cleanses the temple and wants to lock things down. Everything had gone loosey-goosey. He rightfully sees the need for greater control to get everything back on track. And this is the backdrop that Lehi's family would have been living in. Some things to remember. Lehi, we know, would have grown up in the northern kingdom. Right? A few episodes ago, we talked about how some prophets spoke to both the northern and the southern kingdoms, but most of the time a prophet was primarily speaking to one or the other, and the messages they gave had different focus. In the northern kingdom, where Lehi would have spent his formative years, the message he received from prophets had to do with idol worship and injustice. While the prophets speaking to the southern kingdom, where his children were growing up, had to do with temple worship and covenant keeping. So Laman and Lemuel would have grown up hearing a lot about correct temple practices from prophets. At the same time, King Josiah would have been leading reforms to put those teachings into place. Lehi's experience of prophets and policies would not have had that same emphasis, at least not during his formative years. He would have not been as interested in a new orthodoxy for temple practice as his sons were. These reforms were likely the primary cultural force of Laman and Lemuel's youth. While Lehi, with his northern Israelite heritage and Manasseh lineage, may have looked at these reforms as misguided attempts to erase ancient traditions, his oldest sons seem to have been raised in the very heart of this new orthodoxy, and they seem to have really, really, really bought into it as the one and only way to worship God, which is not entirely what King Josiah intended in the first place. As we said last week, Josiah wasn't saying all altars are bad. He was saying, we've got to bring this back in. It's gotten way too out of control. Let's bring it back in. Not necessarily for all time, but for right now. So here's the kind of provocative part of all of this. What if Laman and Lemuel weren't the rebels of the family that we think they are? What if they were just sort of the religious, fundamentalist, conservative, orthodox ones? Don't hear conservative in some modern political sense. Hear it in the sense of they wanted to make sure things were done carefully, and bringing change to that felt unwise. I don't hear fundamentalist as kind of some weird practices. Hear that as they wanted to absolutely legalistically follow the very plain letter of the law and nothing else. So when we look closely at Nephi's record, a striking pattern emerges. Grant Hardy points this out. Nephi had every reason to highlight his brother's moral failures. He never actually accuses them of common sins. He tells us they complain a lot. He had every reason to tell us if they were making moral failures, and he doesn't. Nephi never accuses them of idolatry or of false swearing, Sabbath breaking, drunkenness, adultery, ritual uncleanness. Instead, Nephi says they were like unto the Jews who were at Jerusalem. This is a really crucial clue. What were the Jews who were at Jerusalem like at that moment, at the moment of Laman and Lemuel's youth? Well, they were going super fundamentalist, cleansing the temple, absolutely controlling every single bit of worship. In 600 BC, being like a Jew at Jerusalem meant being an advocate for these reforms that King Josiah brought, and maybe being even more aggressive of an advocate for them than even Josiah himself ever meant. Kevin Christopherson notes, Laman and Lemuel demonstrate a clear sympathy for the Jerusalem party, as it were, the very people who were persecuting prophets like Jeremiah for challenging the new status quo anytime that he tried. Brent Gardner takes this even a step further, suggesting that the Lehi family represents a microcosm of the conflict in Jerusalem. On the one side, you have Lehi, whose theology had strong affinities with the older version, the version of faith that had not been corrupted by these outside cultural influences, this visionary pre-reform faith that was more open to God leading in unusual ways, including through dreams. And on the other side, you have Laman and Lemuel, who seem to have fully bought into the reformers' ideology, where God was leading in one very specific and well-defined way. Now, neither is right or wrong. There are different ways. God works with his people different ways at different times, and different things are needed at different times. Josiah's reforms were needed at their time. It's not that they were bad, but Laman and Lemuel might have simply thought differently than their father about issues of how the Lord leads because of how they were raised and the area that they were raised, the area they were raised in. From this perspective, their murmuring isn't really just complaining. It is complaining, but it's also a little bit more like legalistic objections based on religious standards of the day. They weren't actually trying to be wicked. They were trying to be orthodox. And sometimes in our desire to be orthodox, we miss entirely that the Lord is trying to lead in a different way. The important part is following the Lord, not the means through which he leads us. Laman and Lemuel viewed their father's desert trek not as a divine command, but maybe as a heretical abandonment of the holy city and of centralized worship. The first major point of friction occurs almost as soon as the family leaves the city, right? Lehi reaches his first campsite in the valley of Lemuel, and the very first thing he does is build an altar of stones and makes an offering to the Lord. To us, to a modern reader, this seems like a beautiful act of devotion. To someone like Laman and Lemuel, raised in the shadow of Josiah's reforms, it would have been a scandalous legal violation. A huge part of the reforms that Josiah made was to restrict the building of altars. Previously, altars were everywhere, and they were entirely uncontrolled what people were going to do with them. And they were often infiltrated or corrupted by practices from other religions. So the law, meaning the reforms King Josiah made, strictly prohibit sacrifice and offerings outside of the temple in Jerusalem. This was based on a very specific reading in Deuteronomy, which commanded the sacrifice to only take place in the place which the Lord your God shall choose. And they decided that meant at this one altar in Jerusalem at the temple and nowhere else. Further, sacrifice was the exclusive domain of the Levites. Lehi, a non-Levite from a northern Israel tribe, was performing a sacrifice at a private altar in the desert, and his two older sons were aghast. It is telling that Nephi mentions Laman and Lemuel's murmuring immediately after the sacrifice. When we read against the backdrop of the reforms, it makes a lot more sense. Their complaints were just about the heat or the lack of food. They were reacting to what they perceived as illegal religious activity. In their eyes, their father was breaking the very book of the law. They had been taught to revere these laws, these reforms, and they were deeply confused about why their father would be doing this. This wasn't a family dispute over a camping spot. It was a religious protest against a perceived heretic almost who was performing unauthorized rituals in a place outside of the temple's jurisdiction. What Laman and Lemuel could not understand in that moment was the Lord is not cooped up in one temple in one location, that he was leading these people to an entirely new continent, that he had this wonderful new work to do, and that it would require them to go and do these things that were not being done. But they couldn't see it that way. They were too narrowed down in their fundamentalist point of view. So the brothers' primary insult of their father was what? They called him a visionary man. They claimed he followed the foolish imaginations of the heart. Now, to our ears, visionary almost could sound like a compliment, or maybe at the worst, like a jab at somebody who's a kind of a dreamer. But in the context of King Josiah's reforms, this was a formal legal accusation. Scholars like Matt Roper and others have noted that visionary man is not an accurate translation of the Hebrew word here. Under Josiah's reforms, visions were increasingly rejected as legitimate means of knowing God's will. Before that, visions were not looked at with suspicion, but under Josiah's reforms and the reformers who carry them out, sometimes with more ambition than Josiah himself, start to see visions as very, very, very suspect. The reformers favored the written law above all else. It's as if they said, if God wants to lead, he will lead you with what is written down. They kind of want a closed canon. The word of God was found in the text, not the imaginations of a seer. More importantly, Lehi's visions, which include like seeing the divine counsel and learning mysteries, they represent the exact type of older faith the reformers were trying to eradicate in favor of a more controlled and rational religion. So when Laman and Lemuel call Lehi a visionary man, they're not just name-calling. They were using the language of Deuteronomy 13 and 18 to charge him with being a false prophet. That's what they were doing. According to the standards in those chapters, a prophet who speaks words that do not come to pass or who leads people away from the established statutes was to be rejected. They were declaring their father by the very nature of his spiritual claims and his disregard for the safety that could be found in Jerusalem. They were saying he was a fraud. Interestingly, Nephi seems to have been aware of their specific legal challenge. In his narrative, just before he then introduces his brother's complaints, he carefully notes that the Lord spoke to his father in a dream. Nephi is essentially proof texting Numbers 12:6, by which explicitly states that the Lord makes himself known to prophets through visions and dreams. So he kind of preempts their complaint as like, no. Our father received this word from the Lord in a dream. Now go ahead and try to refute me with the Old Testament, right? By doing this, Nephi is kind of laying down a gauntlet for them. He wants the reader to know that even before their brothers' mouths are opened, that the law itself kind of invalidates their complaint. As the tension in the desert escalates, the conflict takes on kind of a literary and historical dimension. Nephi begins to frame himself kind of as a type of Joseph, right? The younger brother chosen by God to rule over his older siblings. It's brilliant and it's deeply inflammatory to his brothers. The reformers back in Jerusalem generally oppose what's called the wisdom tradition. And that wisdom tradition is associated with figures like Joseph or Daniel. The wisdom tradition emphasized visions and dreams and spiritual insight that operates outside of the strict legal hierarchy. By identifying himself with Joseph, the wise man, Nephi was aligning himself with the very tradition his brothers and the legalistic reformers rejected. To them, Nephi wasn't just an annoying younger brother. He was an usurper trying to overturn the patriarchal order of the law by using the foolish imaginations of the wisdom tradition. So it's an ideological clash. It reaches its breaking point, 1 Nephi chapter 7. After a period of rebellion, the older brothers bind Nephi with the intent to kill him and leave him to be devoured by wild beasts. While this looks like a random act of sibling rivalry, the context suggests a more orthodox motivation. Laman and Lemuel were likely acting as self-appointed executioners. If they truly believed Nephi was a false prophet, one who was prophesying their own deaths and leading them into the wilderness, they would have seen themselves as fulfilling the judgment on false prophets. Deuteronomy 13:6 requires an execution of those who entice people to serve other gods, abandon the covenant, even if the offender is thy brother or thy son or thy mother. From their perspective, they weren't committing murder, they were cleansing the community. They were the heroes of their own story, executing a visionary who was a threat to their religious survival. We, of course, can look at this and say, how upside down, what an awful way. And it's even more tragic than that, because the reforms Josiah tried to put in place, he was doing them with such good intent. He wanted to follow the Lord. The reformers, who are his contemporaries and come after him, take it to too far of an extreme, and it impacts these two young boys, Laman and Lemuel, that they now begin to think in this way. The final and perhaps most fascinating layer of this conflict appears in Lehi's farewell address in 2 Nephi chapter 1. Here, Lehi makes one last attempt to reach his wayward sons. And the way he does it is kind of brilliant, right? He stops talking like a visionary man, and he starts talking like a reformer. Noel B. Reynolds, Book of Mormon scholar, has demonstrated that Nephi's final speech is carefully patterned after Moses' farewell address in the book of Deuteronomy. Lehi invokes at least 14 major themes that have some similarities to Moses' speech, including like the keeping of commandments, the warnings about captivity, that if they are wicked, they will face terrible consequences. Why would Lehi do this? He knew that his sons revered Moses as the ultimate lawgiver. To reach them, he had to use language they respected. By framing himself in that speech as a type of Moses, he was proof texting the very book his sons were using to judge him, using it to validate his own prophetic calling. He's essentially saying, even by the standards of the book you love, I am a legitimate messenger. Right? He's trying to speak their language and still persuade them that the Lord has placed this calling on him and on their family. Lehi wasn't abandoning his visions. He still spoke of revelations and of the Messiah, but he was meeting Laman and Lemuel where they were. He was using their own orthodoxy as a bridge. He was trying to help them see what the Lord was doing, even if it didn't look like what they expected the Lord to be doing. They needed that. Certainly you and I at times need that our eyes can be opened to see the Lord working in ways we would have never imagined that he worked in. When we step back and look at the entire arc of this family drama, we see what can only be called this ideological trajectory. The conflict in Lehi's family was a microcosm of a massive national religious shift. A movement where the older faith of the patriarchs was being systematically replaced by a centralized, kind of text-based legalism. Laman and Lemuel were not simply wicked in the ways that we might easily imagine. They appear to have adopted, perhaps quite deliberately, the very parts of this new reformed ideology that their father rejected. Their perspective allows us to move beyond the simple, like, were they good or were they evil, and see a much more human reality. Two competing religious ideologies, each believing it possessed the truth. Contextualizing these figures changes how we read the Book of Mormon a little bit. We can now see that Laman and Lemuel felt their indignation was probably entirely justified. They weren't just angry brats. They were trying to be orthodox, even though their attempts at that were leading them from where the Lord was trying to get them to go. They were trying to save their family from what they thought were foolish visions or imaginations. They thought their father had abandoned the safe, centralized, legalistic faith at Jerusalem, and that he had chosen the uncertainties of the desert. Understanding this history doesn't justify their violence. It doesn't make them good followers. It doesn't make them good brothers, but it does make them more than just caricatures. It reminds us that the most dangerous conflicts often occur not between actual righteous and unrighteous, but between people who are looking at the same world through two very different religious lenses. Even their murmuring in the wilderness had a history and a context, and one that still echoes today. Thank you for joining me this week. This is a very long episode. We will talk about Ezra next week, the Babylonian exile, and the return of those exiles. See you then.